The boardroom on the 40th floor of Vance Towers still smelled like the perfume of 6 different women. Gavin Vance sat alone at the head of the long glass table, his tie loosened, a half-empty glass of scotch sweating a ring into the wood beside his elbow. An hour ago, this room had been full. His uncle Salvatore had lined up 3 of Chicago's most eligible daughters, one after another, like he was running interviews for a job nobody wanted him to actually do. Gavin had smiled through all of it, said the right things, and dismissed every single one before dessert. He was 29 years old, and he ran the largest family in the city. He'd been raised to believe that power needed a beautiful woman standing next to it to look complete. His father had believed that. His uncle still did. Gavin didn't. He'd watched too many marriages in this business collapse under the weight of ambition dressed up as love, and he'd decided a long time ago that he'd rather be alone than build his life around someone who only wanted the name on his door. He finished the scotch, stood, and reached for his jacket. That was when he saw it, a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, lying near the leg of the trash can by the door. It must have slipped off the cleaning cart. The night janitor always came through around this time, working the floor while the building emptied out, and Gavin had passed her 100 times in the hallway without really seeing her. A quiet woman, kept her head down, never said more than "Good evening, sir," if he caught her eye at all. He almost left it where it was. Then something about the paper stopped him. It was too heavy, too deliberate to be trash. He bent down and picked it up. It was grid paper, the kind architects used, and someone had drawn his penthouse on it. Not a rough sketch. Every hallway, every window, every door was there, measured out in careful lines. Gavin's stomach tightened as he studied it. This wasn't a floor plan pulled from some real estate listing. This was accurate down to details only a handful of people alive should have known. The reinforced wall behind his bedroom, the private elevator shaft his security team had installed only 8 months ago, the exact placement of his rooftop cameras. Someone had mapped every way in and out of his home. His first thought was assassination. His second was betrayal. He'd spent his whole life waiting for the moment someone close to him decided he was worth more dead than alive, and for one cold second, he wondered if that moment had finally come. Then he noticed the handwriting in the margins. It wasn't the handwriting of someone planning to finish him. It was neat, careful, almost gentle. Small notes written beside 3 separate points on the blueprint. Beside the rooftop cameras, blind spot, 6-second gap during rotation. Beside the service entrance, badge reader isn't wired to the main system. Anyone with a copied badge walks straight through. Beside his bedroom window, glass rated for impact, not for heat. A determined person doesn't need a gun. These weren't the notes of someone plotting an attack. These were corrections. Someone had gone through his security, found every hole in it, and written down exactly how to fix each one. Gavin sat back down slowly, the paper still in his hands, his mind running through every person who had access to this building. Architects, contractors, his own security chief. None of them had handwriting like this. None of them would have folded something this important and let it slip onto a cleaning cart by accident. A cleaning cart. He stood again, faster this time, and walked to the door. Down the hall, he could hear the low hum of a vacuum coming from the executive lounge. He followed the sound until he found her. The janitor, small and unassuming in her gray uniform, pushing a cart past the row of empty offices like she did every night, like nothing in the world had shifted. She didn't notice him at first. He watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. She worked quickly, efficiently, her eyes scanning each room before she stepped into it. Not the way someone scans a room to clean it, but the way someone scans a room to know it, to understand it. It was such a small thing, But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He thought about walking up to her right then, demanding answers. But something held him back. Some instinct, honed by years of dealing with liars and killers, told him this wasn't the moment. She had no idea he'd found the blueprint yet. If he confronted her now, exhausted and half-drunk on adrenaline, he might miss whatever she gave away in that first unguarded reaction. So, instead, he folded the paper back along its original creases, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and walked back toward the elevator without a word. Riding down, alone, he pulled the paper out one more time and looked at it under the harsh elevator light. Someone in his building, someone who mopped his floors and emptied his trash cans and said, "Good evening, sir," without ever meeting his eyes, knew exactly how to get into his home and finish him before anyone noticed she was gone. Or she was the only reason he was still alive to wonder about it. Gavin didn't know which answer scared him more, but he knew one thing for certain as the elevator doors opened onto the parking garage. He wasn't going home tonight. He was going to be standing at that employee exit at 6 in the morning, waiting for her to walk out, and he wasn't leaving until she told him everything. Whatever she was, quiet clearly didn't mean harmless. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Gavin Vance was genuinely curious about someone. The loading dock behind Vance Towers was quiet at 6 in the morning, just delivery trucks idling and the smell of exhaust mixing with old coffee from the diner across the street. Gavin stood near the employee exit with his hands in his coat pockets, the folded blueprint still tucked against his chest, and waited. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the last 5 hours in his car, 2 blocks away, running background checks through a contact who owed him a favor, trying to find anything on the janitor with the careful handwriting. Her employment file said her name was Maeve Ellison, hired 11 months ago. No criminal record, no red flags. Nothing that explained why a woman cleaning offices for minimum wage understood his security system better than the men he paid 6 figures a year to run it. At 6:04, the door pushed open and she stepped out. A canvas bag over one shoulder, her uniform swapped for a plain jacket and jeans. She looked smaller out of the fluorescent light of the building, ordinary in a way that made the whole situation feel almost absurd. Then she saw him, standing there, and something in her face changed instantly. Not surprise exactly, more like the look of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a long time and had just run out of time to prepare for it. "Mr. Vance." Her voice was steady, but her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pulled the folded paper out of his coat and held it up between them. "You want to explain this?" For a moment, she didn't move. Then she let out a slow breath, the kind of breath someone takes when a secret they've been carrying finally gets set down. "I was hoping you wouldn't find that until I'd finished the rest of it." "The rest of it?" "There's more," she said. "I've been going through your whole building floor by floor, your penthouse too, from what I could observe on the 2 occasions I was asked to fill in on the residential cleaning staff. I wasn't done." Gavin felt something sharpen in his chest, somewhere between anger and disbelief. "You've been mapping my home." "I've been fixing your home," she said. And for the first time, there was an edge in her voice, something that didn't sound like a janitor at all. "Your security has more holes in it than you'd want to know, Mr. Vance. Your men rely on cameras and guns. Neither one of those things matters if someone already knows the blind spots before they walk in the door." "And how exactly does someone who mops floors know where my blind spots are?" She hesitated. He watched her weigh something behind her eyes, some decision she'd clearly been avoiding for 11 months. And then she seemed to give up trying to avoid it any longer. "I didn't hack anything, if that's what you're worried about," she said. "I looked, that's all. I paid attention to how your men move, where the cameras sweep, which doors get left propped open during shift changes. Most security fails aren't technical.
They're human. People get lazy. People get comfortable. I just noticed.
That's not an answer to my question. Maeve glanced past him toward the street, like she was checking whether anyone else was close enough to hear. Then she looked back at him and said the thing she'd clearly been holding on to since the day she'd walked in for her interview.
My father was Daniel Ellison.
The name didn't mean anything to Gavin at first. Then it did, and it hit him like a fist to the ribs.
Ellison,
he repeated slowly.
the security architect. The one who disappeared. He didn't disappear,
Maeve said, and there was something raw underneath the calm way she said it.
He went into hiding. There's a difference. 12 years ago, some very dangerous people decided my father knew too much about the systems he'd built for half the families in this city, including yours. He got a warning that they were coming for him and for us. Your father was the one who helped him get out. He gave him money, false paperwork, a way to vanish before anyone could touch him.
Gavin's jaw tightened. He remembered fragments of this, hushed conversations his father used to have behind closed doors, a name that came up once or twice and was never explained. He'd been a teenager then, more interested in proving himself than paying attention to old debts his father carried. My father always said your family was the one that kept its word when it mattered, Maeve continued. He never forgot that. Neither did I. When I heard you'd taken over and that your security had gotten sloppy since your father passed, I thought I owed you something. So I took this job. I wasn't going to walk in and hand you a stranger's report. I was going to earn your trust first and show you slowly, piece by piece, so you'd actually listen instead of writing it off as some outsider trying to sell you something. Gavin studied her for a long moment, the blueprint still hanging from his fingers between them. Everything about this story should have sounded absurd, and yet it explained things that nothing else could. The precision of the notes, the calm way she'd delivered information that should have terrified her, the fact that she hadn't run the second she saw him standing there. You could have just told me, he said finally. Would you have believed a janitor who walked into your office claiming to be the daughter of a man everyone assumes is finished? A faint, humorless smile crossed her face. I didn't think so either. He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. The morning traffic was starting to pick up behind them, the city waking into its usual noise, but for a moment, neither of them moved. Gavin looked down at the paper in his hand one more time, at the careful handwriting that had upended everything he thought he understood about the quiet woman standing in front of him, and made a decision that surprised even him. Come with me, he said. I want to see how much you actually know. The garage sat on the outskirts of the city, tucked behind a row of warehouses that looked abandoned from the road. Inside, it was anything but. Rows of cars worth more than most houses lined the walls, and a handful of men Gavin trusted with his life moved between them, running checks, swapping plates, doing the quiet work that kept the family's operations running smooth. It was one of the few places Gavin knew was clean. No outside contractors, no cameras he hadn't installed himself. He'd brought Maeve here to test her. If she really knew what she claimed to know, this was the place to prove it. She walked the garage slowly, quietly, her eyes moving over the security panel by the door, the camera angles bolted into the corners of the ceiling, the placement of the reinforced doors leading to the back office. She didn't touch anything. She didn't need to. Every few steps she'd pause, tilt her head slightly, and say something that made the hair on the back of Gavin's neck stand up. Your camera here has a 2-second lag before it starts recording after motion triggers it, she said, pointing toward the corner above the second bay. Someone who knew that could be through this door and gone before the footage even starts. How do you know that? Because I watched the timestamp drift the last time I was asked to clean the security office upstairs, she said simply. Nobody thinks a woman with a mop is paying attention to timestamps. Gavin was still absorbing that when the door at the far end of the garage swung open and Barrett walked in. Barrett had been Gavin's underboss for 6 years, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had earned his position the hard way and never let anyone forget it. He stopped the second he saw Maeve standing in the middle of the garage floor, and his expression shifted from surprise to something colder. "Who is this?" Barrett's voice cut across the space, low and hard. "She's with me," Gavin said. "With you where? I've never seen her before in my life, and she's standing in the middle of our garage looking at our cameras." Barrett's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, studying Maeve like she was something to be dismantled and examined. "You're the janitor from the towers." "That's right," Maeve said evenly, not backing away. "You know what I think?" Barrett turned to Gavin, ignoring her now. "I think the Moretti family finally figured out that going after you with guns hasn't worked in years, so they sent someone to do it a different way. Get inside close, learn the building, learn the routines. It's not a new play, Gavin. It's the oldest one there is." "She's not a spy," Gavin said. "You don't know that." Barrett's jaw tightened. "You found a blueprint of your own house on the floor of your office, and instead of asking questions, you brought her here, to this garage, where half our operation runs through." He shook his head, already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling this in. We hold her until we're sure." "You're not holding her anywhere." Gavin's voice dropped into something quieter and far more dangerous than anything Barrett had said. The men working near the cars stopped what they were doing, sensing the shift in the room the way people who worked for the family always did. Barrett lowered the phone slowly, but the suspicion in his eyes didn't fade. "You're vouching for her, just like that. Her father is Daniel Ellison." That landed. Gavin watched it land, watched something flicker across Barrett's face that told him the older man understood exactly what that name meant, even if he'd never expected to hear it spoken out loud again. "Ellison's dead," Barrett said, though there was less certainty in it now than before.
"He's not," Maeve said quietly. "He's alive, and he's been hiding for 12 years. Because your family, and mine, decided it was safer that way. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because my father owed a debt to Gavin's father, and I intend to pay it." Barrett studied her for a long, silent moment.
Whatever he was weighing, it wasn't finished, but something in his posture eased just slightly. "If you're lying to me," he said, "there won't be a version of this where it ends well for you."
"I'm not lying."
"That's what everyone says right before they're proven wrong." Gavin stepped between them, not aggressively, but with enough weight that both of them understood the conversation had reached its limit. "She stays," he said, "under my protection. If anyone touches her, they answer to me directly. Not to you, not to anyone else. Are we clear?" Barrett held his gaze for a long beat, the kind of silence that in this business could mean a dozen different things. Finally, he exhaled and nodded once, sharp and reluctant. "Clear." He turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked back at Maeve one more time. "For your sake, I hope you're exactly what you say you are." He walked out, and the garage slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the men going back to their work like nothing had happened, though Gavin could tell from the careful way they avoided looking at Maeve that the tension hadn't fully left the room. Maeve let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since Barrett first walked in.
"That could have gone worse."
"He's not wrong to be careful," Gavin said. "In my world, trust gets people killed faster than bullets do."
"Then why did you vouch for me?"
Gavin looked at her for a moment, thinking about the blueprint folded in his coat pocket, about 11 months of quiet corrections nobody had asked her to make, about a debt she didn't have to honor, but chose to anyway. "Because everything you've shown me so far has been about keeping me alive. Nobody who wanted me gone would bother fixing my blind spots first." Maeve didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, something unreadable behind her eyes,
before nodding slowly, like she was filing his answer away somewhere she intended to remember it. Neither of them noticed Barrett lingering just outside the garage door, watching them through the gap in the frame, his suspicion far from settled.
2 nights later, Gavin brought Maeve up to his penthouse for the first time since the confrontation at the loading dock. It felt strange letting her into the space she'd only ever seen through the eyes of a cleaning schedule, walking rooms she'd once mapped from memory and instinct rather than an actual invitation. She moved through it differently now, more freely, pointing out things as they went. A gap in the hallway camera coverage near the study, a keypad that hadn't been updated with new access codes in over a year, a fire escape route that doubled as an easy entry point for anyone patient enough to study the building's blueprints the way she once had. "Here," she said, stepping onto the glass terrace that wrapped around the far side of the penthouse. The city spread out below them, lights stretching toward the lake. "This is the one that worries me most." Gavin followed her out. The terrace was one of his favorite parts of the apartment. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, open sky above. It had never once occurred to him that it might also be the weakest part of his home. "The glass is rated for impact," Maeve said, running her hand along the frame. "Someone throws a chair at it, it holds, but it's not rated for heat, and it's not wired into the interior alarm grid the same way the rest of the building is. If someone wanted in badly enough and knew what they were doing, this would be the easiest way." "You're saying my own architects missed this?" "I'm saying your architects built for the threats they expected. I'm telling you about the threats they didn't." Gavin was about to respond when the lights went out. Not just the terrace lights, the whole penthouse went black at once, the low hum of the building's electrical system cutting off so abruptly that the silence that followed felt heavier than the dark itself. A second later, the emergency backup should have kicked in automatically. It didn't. "That's not a power failure," Maeve said quietly, already moving away from the glass. "That's deliberate." Gavin's phone buzzed once, a message from his security desk downstairs, cutting off mid-sentence before the signal died entirely. He pulled his weapon from beneath his jacket out of instinct, years of training taking over before his mind had fully caught up. "Jammed," he said. "Someone's cutting our comms." Below them, faint through the darkness, came the sound of the private elevator engaging. The one meant only for Gavin and his closest men, the one that required a code known to fewer than 6 people in the world. "They know the building," Maeve whispered. "They know too much about the building." Gavin's mind raced through the list of people who could have that kind of access, and none of the names sat right. This wasn't a random smash and grab. This was planned, patient, and precise in a way that told him whoever orchestrated it had been watching him for a long time. Voices carried faintly from the stairwell now, low and controlled, the kind of quiet that came from men who'd done this before. Gavin grabbed Maeve's wrist and pulled her back from the terrace doors, away from the glass she'd just warned him about, deeper into the apartment, where the walls at least offered some cover. "How many exits does this floor have that aren't on the main grid?" he asked her, his voice low. Maeve's eyes moved fast, calculating, the fear on her face giving way to something sharper and more focused. "1. A maintenance shaft behind the kitchen pantry. It wasn't on any of the official blueprints. I only found it because I got curious about a service door that didn't match the floor plan on file." "Show me." They moved through the dark apartment together, footsteps as quiet as they could manage, the voices from the stairwell growing closer. Gavin caught the shape of 2 men rounding the corner near the private elevator, flashlight beams cutting sharp lines through the black hallway. And he pulled Maeve down behind the kitchen island just as the beams swept past. "They're not here for money," Maeve breathed, barely audible. "This is a capture operation. They want you alive." "That's worse. For them or for you?" Gavin almost laughed, despite everything, a short, disbelieving breath that had no real humor in it. He risked a glance around the edge of the island. The men were spreading out methodically, checking rooms one by one, moving with the confidence of people who believed the building's security was already dead in their hands. His own men should have been swarming the floor by now. The silence from downstairs told him something had gone wrong there, too, that whoever planned this hadn't just cut the power to his penthouse, but had isolated the entire block, leaving his standard security paralyzed exactly where they stood.
"The pantry,"
Maeve whispered, tugging his sleeve.
"Now, while they're still on the east side."
They moved low and fast across the kitchen, Gavin's shoulder brushing the counter as a beam of light swept close enough to catch the edge of his sleeve. A voice called out from the hallway, sharp and alert, and footsteps began closing in behind them. Maeve reached the pantry door first, her fingers finding a seam in the back paneling that looked, to anyone who hadn't spent months studying this exact wall, like nothing more than a decorative panel. She pressed against it, and it gave way, revealing a narrow, dark space behind it that smelled of dust and old wiring. "In," she said. Gavin didn't hesitate. He pushed her through first, following close behind, and pulled the panel shut just as the beam of a flashlight swept across the kitchen they'd left behind. Through the thin wall, he heard footsteps stop in the exact spot where they'd been crouched only seconds earlier, a voice muttering something low and frustrated in the dark. Beside him, in the cramped space of the hidden shaft, Maeve's breathing was fast but controlled, her hands still resting against the panel like she was ready to move again the second she needed to. Gavin looked at her in the near-total darkness. The woman who'd once been invisible to him in her gray uniform, now the only reason he was still breathing. "Which way now?" he asked quietly. "Down," she said, "and then we run." The shaft dropped them into a narrow service corridor that ran behind the building's kitchens and utility rooms, a part of Vance Towers that Gavin had never once set foot in during the years he'd owned it. Pipes ran along the ceiling, wrapped in insulation gone yellow with age, and the only light came from Maeve's phone, its screen turned down low so it wouldn't throw a glow through the gaps in the walls. Barrett was waiting for them at the bottom of the first ladder, having slipped away from the chaos on the lower floors the moment the lights failed. He'd taken a graze along his forearm from someone's stray shot near the stairwell, but his voice was steady when he found them. "We need to move up, not down," he said. "Fight through their line while we've still got the advantage of knowing this floor."
"They outnumber us, and they know we're armed,"
Gavin said.
"Fighting through gets men finished for no reason."
"Standing still gets you captured."
"We're not standing still."
Gavin looked at Maeve.
"Tell him what you told me."
She didn't waste time explaining herself to a man who doubted her from the start. She simply moved past him toward a junction where the corridor split 3 ways, tracing her fingers along a rusted pipe until she found a seam in the concrete that didn't match the rest of the wall. "This building used to connect to an old freight tunnel from back when deliveries came through underground instead of the loading dock. It was sealed off decades ago and never fully removed from the original architectural plans, just buried under newer construction. I found the reference to it in a maintenance log nobody had touched in 15 years. "You're telling me there's a way out of this building that isn't on any current blueprint," Barrett said, some of the hostility draining out of his voice, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "I'm telling you there's a way out that whoever planned this attack doesn't know about," Maeve said.
"Which is exactly why it's the only route I trust right now."
Above them, muffled through the layers of the building, came the sound of raised voices and a door being forced open. Their pursuers had reached the pantry.
"They'll find the panel," Gavin said. "Then we move faster than they do."
Maeve pressed her shoulder against a section of the wall that looked identical to every other section around it, and after a moment of resistance, it gave way with a groan of old metal, revealing a narrow gap just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. They moved through it one at a time, Barrett bringing up the rear with his weapon drawn, watching the corridor behind them for any sign of movement. The freight tunnel on the other side was older than anything Gavin had seen in the building, brick walls slick with damp, the air thick with the smell of stone and standing water. It ran in a straight line for what felt like a quarter-mile, sloping gently downward, and Maeve led them through it without hesitation, checking her phone only twice to confirm a turn. "How do you know this connects to the subway?" Barrett asked, breathing hard as they moved.
Because the original construction permits for this building listed an underground link to the transit system as a requirement back when it was built, Maeve said. City regulations at the time. It got sealed off when the building changed ownership, but sealed isn't the same as gone. They reached a rusted grate near the end of the tunnel, and Maeve knelt beside it, working her fingers along the edge until she found the give in the old bolts. Gavin helped her pry it loose, the metal shrieking softly in protest before coming free, and beyond it stretched the unmistakable hum and rumble of a subway line, distant lights flickering along the tunnel walls.
"We're not out of the woods yet," Gavin said, glancing back the way they'd come. Somewhere above and behind them, their pursuers were still searching, but the gap between the building and this tunnel was widening with every second. They climbed through the grate onto the maintenance walkway that ran alongside the active subway tracks, the noise of a passing train briefly swallowing every other sound. Maeve moved with a strange kind of calm now, the panic from the penthouse replaced by the focus of someone working through a problem she already understood the shape of.
There's a maintenance stairwell about 200 feet ahead, she said,
Raising her voice over the noise.
It comes up inside a closed newsstand on the platform level. Nobody uses it during off hours.
Barrett looked at her with something that hadn't been there in the garage 2 days earlier. Not full trust yet, but respect, grudging and real. You planned an exit route through a building you've cleaned for less than a year.
I plan exit routes out of habit, Maeve said. My father taught me that the moment you walk into a new place, you find out how you'd leave it if you had to. I never expected to actually need one here.
They reached the stairwell and climbed up into the newsstand. The metal shutter rolled halfway down, city noise filtering in from the street beyond. Gavin stepped out first, scanning the block for any sign they'd been followed, and found nothing but the ordinary rush of a city that had no idea how close it had just come to hosting a war. Barrett leaned against the wall, catching his breath, the graze on his arm finally getting the attention it needed as he pressed a hand against it. "Not a single shot fired on our end," he said, half to himself. "I've never walked out of something like that clean." "You didn't walk out clean because of luck," Gavin said, looking at Maeve, who stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself against the early morning chill, still processing everything that had just happened. "You walked out clean because of her." Maeve met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd found the blueprint on his boardroom floor, Gavin saw something other than caution in her expression. Relief, maybe. Or the quiet disbelief of someone who'd spent months preparing for a disaster she never truly believed would come, and had just watched every hour of that preparation save 3 lives, including her own. "We need a place to disappear for a while," Gavin said. "Somewhere off the grid until we know who did this and why." "I know somewhere," Barrett said. "My cousin's cabin up in Wisconsin. Nobody knows about it, not even our own people." Gavin nodded once, already moving toward the street to flag down transportation that couldn't be traced. Behind him, Maeve fell into step without needing to be told, the 3 of them disappearing into the early morning crowd like they'd never been anywhere near the tower they'd just escaped. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by pine trees thick enough to swallow the sound of the highway a mile back. Barrett's cousin used it maybe twice a year, mostly for hunting season, and the dust on the furniture made it clear nobody had been through in months. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. But after the night they'd had, it felt like the safest place in the world. Gavin hadn't slept more than an hour, sitting up near the window with his weapon within reach, watching the tree line for headlights that never came. By the time the sun came up fully, painting the frost on the grass a pale gold, he'd started to believe they'd actually made it somewhere their pursuers couldn't follow. He found Barrett in the kitchen, already up, working through a pot of coffee that smelled like it had been made from grounds someone had left in the cabinet since the last hunting trip. The older man looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the missed sleep, his eyes fixed on the window overlooking the woods. "You should let someone look at that arm," Gavin said, nodding toward the bandage Barrett had wrapped around his forearm the night before, using nothing but a torn shirt and steady hands.
It's fine. Grazes always look worse than they are. Barrett poured a second cup and set it on the counter without being asked, a small gesture that Gavin understood for what it was. "Where's the girl?" "Sleeping, last I checked." Barrett was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "I owe her an apology."
"You don't owe me anything,"
Maeve said from the doorway, and both men turned to find her standing there, hair pulled back, looking more like herself than she had since the blackout hit the penthouse. "I do," Barrett said, setting the cup down. "I called you a spy in front of your face. Accused you of working with the Morettis without a shred of proof, just because I didn't like not knowing who you were. And last night, you're the only reason all three of us are standing in this kitchen instead of dead, or worse." He shook his head, something genuinely humbled in his expression. "I've been doing this a long time. I don't say I'm wrong very often, but I was wrong about you." Maeve stepped further into the kitchen, some of the tension she'd been carrying since the garage finally easing out of her shoulders.
"You were doing your job. Protecting him is your job. I'd rather work with someone who's careful than someone who trusts too easily."
"Careful is one word for it." Barrett managed something close to a smile, the first Gavin had seen from him in days. "Stubborn is another." "I've been called worse." Barrett excused himself not long after, mumbling something about checking the perimeter, though Gavin suspected it was as much about giving them space as it was about actual security. The cabin fell quiet, except for the crackle of the wood stove and the wind moving through the pines outside. Gavin made breakfast out of whatever they'd found in the pantry, eggs and toast cooked over the old stove, nothing fancy, and they ate at the small table by the window, watching the morning light shift slowly through the trees. "You never told me why you actually took the job," Gavin said eventually. "The debt explains why you wanted to help. It doesn't explain why you chose a mop over just walking into my office and telling me the truth from day one." Maeve considered the question for a long moment before answering.
"Because I like the work. Not the cleaning, the other part. Finding the gaps in a system. Figuring out how someone could get in where they're not supposed to. Fixing it before it becomes a problem. My father used to let me sit in on his consultations when I was a little. I used to think it was the most interesting thing in the world."
Watching him look at a building and see all the ways it could fail. She wrapped both hands around her mug.
"What I don't like is this part. The guns, the running, the not knowing if someone's going to break down a door in the middle of the night. I grew up watching that fear wear my father down until there was nothing left of the man who used to love his work. I don't want that life."
"But you walked straight into it anyway."
"Because I thought I could fix your security quietly and disappear before it ever came to this," she said. "I miscalculated. Whoever came for you last night was more prepared than I expected, and now I'm sitting in a cabin in the middle of nowhere instead of finishing a shift and going home to sleep."
Gavin set his fork down, studying her across the table in a way he hadn't let himself do until now, without the urgency of danger crowding out everything else. "I meant what I said last night, about what you did for us."
"I know."
"I want to offer you something," he said. "Not out of obligation, not because of the debt my father owed yours. Because I've spent 2 days watching you do something none of my paid security experts have managed in years. And I think building a version of my operation where you're at the center of it, not hiding behind a mop, is the smartest decision I could make." Maeve looked at him carefully, like she was trying to figure out whether this was a business proposal or something else entirely, and finding that the line between the two had gotten harder to draw than either of them expected.
"And if I say yes?"
"Then you never have to hide who you are again. No more uniform, no more pretending not to notice things. You'd run security the way it should be run, And I'd make sure nobody in this business ever mistakes you for someone who can be pushed around again." Outside, the wind picked up, sending a scatter of pine needles against the window, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Maeve finally nodded, slow and certain.
"I'll help you secure your empire,"
she said.
"but I want it understood from the start. I'm not doing this because of a debt anymore. I'm doing it because for the first time in a long time, someone's asking me to stop hiding. And I think I'm ready to say yes to that."
Gavin felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with security or debts or the danger still hanging over both their heads. He didn't have a name for it yet, but sitting across from her in that quiet cabin, morning light spilling over the table between them, he was fairly certain he didn't want the feeling to go away anytime soon. 2 days later, Maeve sat hunched over a laptop at the cabin's kitchen table, a tangle of cables running to an old router Barrett had picked up from a hardware store an hour away, paying cash and giving a fake name out of habit. She'd been at it since early morning, tracing something Gavin didn't fully understand, her expression growing more focused with every hour that passed.
"I found it,"
she said finally, turning the screen toward him. Gavin leaned over her shoulder. Lines of code meant nothing to him, but the way her finger traced a specific string of numbers told him she'd found something that mattered. "Found what?"
"How they knew where to find you that night."
She pulled up a second window, a map of signal pings scattered across the city.
"Your encrypted comms aren't as encrypted as whoever built them promised you. There's a digital signature buried in every message that goes through your private line. A kind of fingerprint. Whoever attacked the penthouse wasn't guessing where you'd be. They were tracking that signature in real time."
Gavin felt his stomach tighten. That system was supposed to be untraceable.
"Nothing's untraceable if someone's patient enough,"
Maeve said.
"And whoever's doing this has been patient for a while. This isn't a rival family making a lucky guess. This is someone who's had access to your communications for weeks, maybe longer."
Barrett, who'd been quiet near the window, straightened at that. "You're saying someone close to us is feeding information out?"
"I'm saying someone has been," Maeve said carefully. "I haven't traced it back to a name yet, just a pattern. Every time you've used that line in the last month, the signature shows up pinging toward a relay server registered under a shell company. It's sophisticated. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing."
Gavin sat down slowly, running a hand through his hair, his mind cycling through the short list of people who had access to that communication line. It wasn't a long list. That was what made it worse. "We're not going to figure out who by staring at a screen," Barrett said. "We need to draw them out."
"That's exactly what I was thinking,"
Maeve said, and something in her voice shifted. The careful caution of the last few days, replaced by the same sharp focus Gavin had seen in her the moment she started walking his building floor by floor.
"If they're tracking a digital signature, we control what that signature says. We feed them false information, make them believe you're going to be somewhere specific, somewhere we choose, on our terms instead of theirs."
Gavin looked up. "You want to bait them?"
"I want to trap them," Maeve corrected. "There's a difference. My father used to talk about something he called a structural trap. You don't chase the threat. You build an environment where the threat corners itself without realizing it until it's too late to leave."
She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, the same kind of grid paper Gavin had found on his boardroom floor what felt like a lifetime ago, and started sketching as she talked.
"We need somewhere large, isolated, with limited entry points and no cell coverage to speak of. Somewhere they'll believe is a natural place for you to hide, so the trap doesn't feel like a trap."
"The old railway terminal outside Gary," Barrett said slowly. "It's been shut down for 15 years. Historic building, mostly gutted, sits on land nobody's touched since the line stopped running. It's the kind of place people go when they're trying to disappear."
Maeve's pen moved faster across the paper.
Perfect. Old buildings like that usually have layered structural systems, vault rooms, reinforced sections built for cargo security back when the terminal handled freight. If I can find the original architectural records, I can identify a section that locks down from a single control point. We route the false signal to draw them into that section.
Then seal it before they realize what's happening. And if they bring more men than we expect? Gavin asked. Then the structure does the work, instead of your men having to, Maeve said. That's the whole point. Nobody needs to fire a shot if the building itself becomes the trap. We use the false signature to plant a specific time and location in their tracking data. Once they commit to entering the terminal, we lock the vault room remotely, cut their communication the same way theirs cut yours, and force a negotiation from a position where they have no options left. Gavin studied the rough sketch taking shape under her hands, the terminal's layout emerging in the same precise, careful lines he'd first found folded on his boardroom floor. It was strange, watching her build something meant to end this conflict with the exact same skill she'd once used just to keep him safe from a distance.
You realize if this works, he said, it ends the threat completely. No more running, no more wondering who's watching.
That's the idea, Maeve said, not looking up from the paper.
And if it doesn't work?
She finally lifted her eyes to meet his, steady despite everything sitting behind them. Then we'll have given them exactly the confidence they need to walk into a room they can't walk back out of, unless we let them. Barrett let out a low breath that was almost a laugh.
Remind me never to underestimate a woman with a blueprint again.
Gavin didn't say anything for a moment, watching Maeve finish the last details of her sketch, the plan for the trap solidifying into something real on the page in front of them. Whatever fear had followed them out of the penthouse and through the tunnels beneath the city, it felt, for the first time since that night, like it finally had a shape they could fight against, instead of one they could only run from.
2 days, Maeve said, setting down her pen.
That's how long I'll need to confirm the terminal's structural records and set up the false signature. After that, we let them come to us.
The old railway terminal looked exactly the way Maeve had promised it would from the archived records. A hollow shell of a building, its high arched ceilings still holding onto traces of grandeur beneath decades of dust. The platforms long since stripped of their tracks. Moonlight cut through broken skylights, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor where freight cars used to load a century ago. Gavin stood near the old ticket counter with Barrett a few steps behind him, both of them watching the main entrance, while Maeve worked from a small control room tucked above the platform level, monitoring the false signal she'd planted 3 days earlier.
"They've entered the building,"
she said through the radio, her voice steady despite the tension underneath it.
12 men, moving toward the vault section, exactly where we wanted them.
The rival family's men moved through the terminal with the confidence of people who believed they were walking into an ambush of their own making, weapons drawn, spreading out to secure a target they thought was cornered and unaware. What they didn't know was that every hallway they chose, every door they moved through, had been quietly reinforced and rerouted over the last 2 days under Maeve's direction, funneling them steadily toward a single, reinforced room built decades ago to secure high-value cargo. The moment the last of them stepped through the vault room's heavy doorway, Maeve's voice came through the radio again, calm and certain.
"Sealing it now."
A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the terminal as the old vault door swung shut, followed by the heavy clank of a locking mechanism that hadn't been used in years, but had been carefully restored for exactly this purpose. Inside, muffled shouting and pounding started almost immediately, but the walls were thick enough that it barely carried. Gavin walked toward the reinforced security glass set into the vault room's observation window, the same kind of glass Maeve had once warned him about on his own terrace, except here it worked entirely in their favor. On the other side stood the rival boss, a lean man named Rossi Moretti, his face twisted with fury as he realized exactly what had happened to his men.
"You think a locked room solves anything?" Rossi shouted through the glass. You think this ends here? It does tonight, Gavin said, his voice calm enough to carry through the small speaker grate built into the frame. You came here to take something from me. Instead, you walked your whole crew into a room they can't leave until I decide they can. You had help, Rossi spat. Someone mapped this place for you. Someone mapped your whole life for you, from what I hear. That's right. Gavin glanced back toward the control room, where Maeve had just stepped out to join them, her face unreadable in the dim light. And she's the reason you're standing on that side of the glass, instead of me being on the other side of a very different room right now. Rossi's eyes moved to Maeve with something like grudging recognition. The janitor, he said. We heard about her. Should have taken the warning more seriously. You should have, Maeve said simply.
Gavin stepped closer to the glass, his voice hardening. Here's how tonight ends. You sign a permanent truce, in writing, ending any claim your family has on my territory, my operations, or anyone connected to me. You call off whatever campaign you started against me the moment you walk out of that room. And in exchange, I let all of you walk out of here breathing, which is a lot more mercy than you planned on showing me. Rossi's jaw worked for a long moment, calculating, clearly searching for a way out that didn't exist. Finally, something in his posture deflated, the fight draining out of him now that the room around him had made the decision for him. You'll have your truce. There's one more thing, Gavin said. I want to know who's been feeding you information about my private communications. Someone close to me has been talking, and I intend to know who before I walk out of this building. Rossi's mouth curled into something bitter, almost amused. You really don't know? Enlighten me. Your uncle, Rossi said. Salvatore. He's been feeding us details for months. Said if we destabilized you enough, made you look weak, made you desperate enough to need an alliance, you'd finally agree to marry into the family he's been trying to align you with for years. He never wanted us to actually hurt you, just scare you into needing us. Rossi shook his head. Guess his plan didn't account for the janitor. Gavin felt the words land like a slow, cold weight settling into his chest. All those socialites paraded in front of him, all those dinners Salvatore had arranged, hadn't just been persistent family pressure. They'd been the surface of something far more calculated. A plan that had put Barrett's life, Maeve's life, and his own directly in danger. All so his uncle could force an alliance through fear instead of choice. Barrett, standing nearby, went pale with something between fury and disbelief. Salvatore, he repeated quietly, like he needed to say it out loud to fully believe it. We'll deal with that after tonight, Gavin said, though his voice had gone hard in a way that promised exactly how seriously he intended to deal with it. He turned back to Rossi. Get your men ready. Someone will bring the documents in an hour, and you'll sign every page before any of you leave this building. He stepped back from the glass and looked at Maeve, who was watching him carefully, understanding without needing to be told exactly what this revelation meant for the family Gavin had spent his whole life protecting. You were right about everything, Gavin said quietly. Every blind spot you found in the building. I just never thought I'd have one this close to home. Maeve reached out and rested a hand lightly on his arm, the first time she'd initiated any kind of contact between them since the night this had all begun. We'll fix that too, she said, just like everything else. Behind the glass, Rossi Moretti sat down slowly on the cold vault floor, defeated, while above them the old terminal stood silent and still, holding the weight of everything that had just changed. 3 days after the terminal, Gavin sat across from his uncle in a private room at the family's estate outside the city. The same room where Salvatore had once lined up socialites like they were interviewing for a position nobody wanted them to actually earn. This time, there was no lineup, no forced smiles, just the two of them and the quiet, heavy truth sitting between them. Salvatore didn't deny it when Gavin laid out what Rossi had confessed. He tried, at first, to frame it as protection, as concern for the family's future, as the kind of hard decision a man in his position sometimes had to make for the people he loved, whether they understood it or not. Gavin let him talk until he ran out of justifications, and then told him plainly that he would never again hold any position of influence within the family's operations. It wasn't punishment born of cruelty. It was the same principle Maeve had taught him without meaning to. You don't chase every threat with force. Sometimes you simply remove it from the structure and make sure it can never find its way back in. Salvatore left the estate that same week, quieter than Gavin had ever seen him, and the subject was never raised again within the family. By the time the last of that business was settled, Chicago had moved into early spring, and the private botanical garden Gavin had chosen for the ceremony was in full, unhurried bloom. It belonged to a friend of his mother's, tucked behind iron gates on the north side of the city, glass greenhouses filled with orchids and climbing vines that nobody outside a small circle even knew existed. It felt right for exactly that reason. Nothing about this day was meant for show. Maeve stood near the fountain at the garden's center, dressed simply, her hair loose for what Gavin realized might be the first time he'd ever seen it that way. Gone was the gray uniform. Gone was the careful, invisible posture she'd carried through 11 months of pretending not to notice things. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, completely unguarded. "Nervous?" Barrett asked, standing beside Gavin near the archway of white flowers, his earlier suspicion of Maeve now nothing but a story he liked to tell at her expense whenever the mood allowed. "No," Gavin said, and meant it. He'd spent his whole life certain that marriage in his world was a transaction dressed up as romance, something arranged for advantage rather than chosen for its own sake. Standing here now, watching Maeve walk slowly toward him down a path lined with flowers neither of them had picked for status or spectacle, he understood the difference for the first time. The ceremony itself was small, attended only by the people who had actually earned a place in either of their lives. Barrett, a handful of loyal men who'd stood by Gavin through every version of the chaos that led here, and two of Maeve's father's oldest friends, brought quietly out of hiding for the day under careful protection. The first time in 12 years, Daniel Ellison's closest circle had gathered in one place without fear hanging over it. Gavin had considered, more than once, what he wanted to say when this moment finally came. In the end, he kept it simple, the same way Maeve had always approached every problem she solved for him. He told her that she'd walked into his life carrying a folded piece of paper that should have terrified him, and instead, it had shown him the first person who ever looked at his world and wanted to fix it rather than take something from it. He told her that everything he thought he knew about power, about who deserved to stand beside it, had been wrong, and that he was grateful every single day that a blueprint had slipped off a cleaning cart at exactly the right moment. Maeve, when it was her turn, said something quieter, something that made even Barrett go still by the archway. She told him that she'd spent years watching her father live in fear of the very world Gavin came from, and that she'd expected, when she took the job at Vance Towers, that she was walking into more of the same. Instead, she'd found someone who listened, who protected her before he ever had reason to trust her completely, and who gave her back the one thing her family had lost 12 years earlier: the ability to stop hiding. When the ceremony ended, Gavin made one final announcement to the small gathering, something he'd been planning for weeks. He told them that Maeve would no longer be known simply as his wife within the family's operations, though she would certainly be that too. She would take on the role of Chief Security Architect for the entire Vance Empire, overseeing every layer of protection across the business, with full authority and full trust, answerable to no one but Gavin himself. Barrett was the first to step forward afterward, offering his hand to Maeve with something that looked almost like pride. "Chief Security Architect," he said,
Has a better ring to it than Janitor, I'll admit.
The pay's better too,
Maeve said, and for the first time since Gavin had known her, she laughed freely, without the careful restraint she'd carried through nearly every conversation before this one. Later, as the sun dropped low over the garden and the small gathering settled into quiet conversation among the flowers, Gavin found Maeve standing near the fountain again, looking out over the space the way she looked at every space now, out of habit more than necessity, cataloguing exits and angles even in a place with nothing left to fear.
Old habits,
she said, catching him watching her. I hope they never go away, Gavin said, stepping beside her. They're the reason I'm standing here at all. She leaned into him, the weight of everything they'd survived finally settling into something that felt less like danger and more like peace. Somewhere behind them, Barrett was telling one of Maeve's father's old friends the story of a rusted grate and a subway tunnel, exaggerating his own bravery with every retelling, and the sound of easy laughter carried across the garden into the fading evening light. Gavin Vance had spent years believing that the woman standing beside his empire needed to look like power to be worthy of it. Instead, the one who actually understood every wall, every blind spot, every hidden way in and out of his entire world, had been quietly watching over him from the very beginning, mop in hand, waiting for the moment he was finally ready to see her.